Hello, today in my writing process playlist I'm going to discuss outlining and making backstories. What I mean by that is brief paragraphs, sort of historical timelines, anything that helps me flesh out my story before I actually get to the story outline, which I will be starting very soon. I'm going to start with my kind of main historical timeline. This was actually quite difficult because there are several hundreds of years that go by before my story takes place. I mean, it's hard to predict the future, so you have to think really hard about what you're going to have happen. Because I wanted this to be the kind of technological level of medieval times, it was very difficult to think about all the things that we have now that we take for granted and that I wanted to kind of not be there anymore, and reasons for them not being there. So I had to go through and in the outline I kind of start in the present and I go backwards. There's the Second Dark Age, and I'm not going to say too much about what happens during these because I don't want to give away spoilers, but that one is, I guess, a bit self-explanatory. But as we go back, we go into the Veiled Era, which is kind of an era of mystery, and there's not a lot of records from that time, so everything is a bit vague. Then before that, they call it the Ashen Memory, and I'll explain what that is in the book, obviously, but suffice it to say, things were not going well for the world during this time. There's this kind of post-digital age where everything kind of goes out of control, and then I go back to the digital age and the industrial age. The reason I'm doing this is because I want this world to feel like it's lived in. I want it to feel like there's a past. I'm not going to give history lessons in the book, but I will have characters mention certain events, and I think it's good to have it laid out in my head with very specific dates. I didn't go in and chronicle every single event that happened, every little battle or every little disaster, but I got the kind of broad happenings. So from there, I decided that I wanted to flesh out all the little things, all the little details. So I created a document. I start talking about some of the events. These are just expanding some of the ideas in the timeline, but it's also discussing different places and what has happened in these different places, some different battles that have occurred. In my story, the spiritual forces are clashing, and I discuss how that has come about and also why these things are happening. Then I got into some of my main character backgrounds. The main sort of three characters aside from my main character, I did backgrounds for. They're not very long, but they're long enough for me to get an idea of where they come from. I will expand a lot of this as I'm writing, but I need some place to start, and I think by just writing something quickly gives me kind of a starting place. You know, when you're writing, there's a lot of invention time when you're writing, and much of this will be fleshed out as I'm doing that, but it's good to find a starting point. Then I have paragraphs on the different locations. The last video I talked about maps, and so this is kind of filling that out a little bit. I have my main location of Hieron, and I'm talking a bit about the sea that is next to it, and some other geographical locations, some ruins that are near there, and this kind of New Jericho city, which is an important part of the story. So I wanted to kind of get that laid out a little bit, and some other locations. And I already showed this timeline in a previous video, but just to kind of give you an idea, I did add a little bit to my protagonist backstory. This is obviously the most detailed of all the backstories, and it's several pages long, but a lot of this coincides with the other events that have happened. And this actually goes right up to when my story starts, and I actually included some things that are after the story just because they are tied to his backstory, and I want to keep them in the same place. So these backstories and histories, they depend on your project. If you're just doing, let's say, a detective story set in a city that we know, you probably don't have to do a lot of this. You already know the backstory probably. Unless it's a city you're not familiar with and you have to do some research, maybe you would do it for that. But if it's a place you know and you know the history of it, when I wrote my first novel, it took place in the present day at that time, and it was super easy to write in that regard. I had very little in terms of the real world that I had to contend with. Everything that I had to research was kind of more mystical or fantastical, whereas in this book, the whole thing is fantastical to a degree, because I'm making up a future. So there's just a lot of little nooks and crannies you have to pay attention to. When you do these for main characters, it gives them kind of context, it gives them depth and dimension, it helps define their character flaws or motivations or the quests that they're on. It establishes the intricacies of their group. Where do they belong? If it's a clan or a gang or a company or something. It establishes their geographic location and how this affects their story. You always have a lot of stories where someone gets pulled out of a location and they're kind of a fish out of water. It helps to know the location that you're pulling them out of. Some other reasons for these backstories could be exposition, telling the reader about past events, flashbacks that you want to relate. This is actually quite important for mine. In my next video, I'm going to discuss my anamnesis timelines, and that has a lot to do with flashbacks. It could also deal with reflection, thinking about past events, and dialogue. This reflects in the things they say, their regional dialects, their stories, etc., and where they're going, based on where they've been. My next video will flesh out the main character and his other lives. And what I mean by this is I'm going to do timelines of his journeys into anamnesis. The reason I'm doing this before my main outline, this is kind of the final thing that I have to do, is I want to story arc these flashbacks, these kind of visions he's having, so I know how those things go from A to B and the whole sort of process that will happen within these kind of mini stories that are inside the main story. And the reason I'm doing that is because when I make the final outline, it's much easier for me to bring those into it and figure out where to put them than to try to outline them in with my main story, because they're not really part of my main story. They're kind of tangential. So I'm doing that to make it easier on myself. But that's about all I got. And I will do those timelines, and then I'm probably going to take a couple weeks off from this playlist just because I'm going to be working on my main outline, and then I will probably do my first main outline video. And that's about all I got. Take care.